Dave, this is amazing. It really looks like a spaceship flying through space. But you guys filmed this kind of the same way they did the original?
No, actually, when they did the original, they were actually able to go ahead and move the model. We couldn't move the model, so we just moved the camera. So I built several rigs that would allow me to move the camera and make it look like it was flying through space.
Hey, John, do we have the astronauts delivering the opening lines?
Oh, sure, Beth. Hold on a second.
Space, the final frontier.
The final frontier.
These are the voyages
of the Starship Enterprise.
That's really cool. Can you guys put the two of them together and see what that looks like?
Sure, it's right here.
Space.
The final frontier.
These are the voyages
of the Starship Enterprise.
Its 5-year mission.
Its 5-year mission.
To explore strange new worlds.
Strange new worlds.
New life.
New life.
And new civilizations.
And to boldly go.
To boldly go where no man.
No man.
No one.
Has gone before.
You guys are a bunch of digital wizards. It's pretty amazing to think of the stuff that was science fiction 50 years ago and has now become science reality. I just wish we could teleport.
That's a thing.
That's a thing?
That's a thing.
You've got to tell me about this.
Sure, do you have some time?
I got about 30 minutes.
This is STEM in 30.
One to beam up.
What? Beam me up. And she forgot her stuff. Great.
This is STEM in 30.
Hi, I'm Beth Wilson, and welcome to our very first STEM in 30 of this season. We are coming to you live from the Boeing Milestones of Flight Hall at the National Air and Space Museum in downtown Washington, D.C.
And I'm Marty Kelsey, and you forgot your stuff. You also forgot your costume. I've got mine.
Listen, Marty, I'm an educator, not an actress, and we decided not on costumes. We have our nice red shirts.
Yeah, but the red shirts didn't turn out so well for the guys that wore them on the original series. Now, anyway, I'd like to welcome some students that we have in the audience today. Kelly Miller Middle School, who is joining us. They've got some great questions that they're going to be asking our experts today. Welcome.
And we'd also like to remind you, those of you watching online, that on the right-hand side, you'll see a chat box. If you put a question in there, we might take one live on the air. If not, we have an expert right here ready to answer.
Well, if you haven't figured it out, today's show is all about Star Trek. The show went on the air 50 years ago this month, and many of the things that were fictional elements back then have become fact today. As a matter of fact, one of the things that they had was this box kind of tablet thing that they could read information off of or record information on, and it looks eerily like an iPad that you might be watching the show on today, but that was 40 years before the iPad was actually invented.
Now, Marty, our show is called STEM in 30. STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and math. What does that have to do with science fiction?
Well, there's another term that's gaining some steam, and that is STEAM. And that stands for science, technology, engineering, the arts, and math. And Star Trek is a great example of STEAM because real science influenced the fiction.
And actually, you got a chance to talk to someone who was very knowledgeable about this. Let's see what they had to say.
Make it so. I'm joined by Rod Roddenberry, the son of Gene Roddenberry, creator of Star Trek, and you're a co-founder of the Roddenberry Foundation. Thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, a lot of the science fiction that your dad invented was actually grounded in science fact.
Yeah, actually, yeah, a lot of people give my father credit for inventing these technologies, but he really didn't credit himself that way. He was just a writer, but he was an intelligent person who knew the right people to talk to. So he would call up the agencies and the institutions that were working on these technologies. For example, there was a book called The Making of Star Trek by Stephen Whitfield, and in that book, I believe there was a passage where my father wrote a letter to either Caltech or JPL, and he said, "We're looking for this, non-lethal weapon. And, what are you guys working on? What would you suggest?" And they said, well, this is the early 60s, and they were developing lasers. But they said, what's coming up is the phasing laser. And so that's where the phaser came from. And so it really strikes me as fantastic that all these technologies that we hear about in Star Trek and love, they actually came from sources that were already working on them.
That's incredible. Well, thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, not only was the fiction of Star Trek influenced by real science, but a lot of designers and engineers have a really strong background in the arts and music. As a matter of fact, there have been a lot of astronauts that have taken instruments with them into space, and our friend Kjell Lindgren actually took a bagpipe with him.
Now, Star Trek is the perfect example of STEAM. It is actually fiction, it's literature, it's science fiction, but to have great science fiction, you have to have great fiction and terrific science, and that's what Star Trek did. It combined the two, and not only did it entertain, but it also inspired.
Yeah, Star Trek created this world of imagination that portrayed a universe of unlimited possibilities, and in the process, it inspired an entire generation of scientists and engineers and even astronauts.
And we got a chance to talk to some of those people about how science fiction inspired them. Did science fiction influence your career path at all?
Most definitely. Actually, I probably was always going to be an engineer of some sort, but when I started really getting into science fiction, Star Trek, Star Wars, I really started to understand, I really want to work in the aerospace industry. I want to build space vehicles. And so that sort of changed me from just being a mechanical engineer into really wanting and focusing in on what I wanted to do.
I really like the science fiction that has to do more with futuristic or with technology, something like Back to the Future, where you're testing technology and kind of pushing the edges of technology. I believe that that's really important for the missions that NASA would like to do for deep space. So anything that's futuristic or, big techno, I'm a big fan of.
I was a huge bookworm when I was little and read everything I could get my hands on, but science fiction was something that I was very interested in. Reading Heinlein and Clarke, Orson Scott Card, these had a huge influence on me.
As I got older, I came to appreciate that science fiction drove a lot of the imagination that ultimately engineering was able to create. So you had kind of the inspiration within science fiction and these big dreamers and thinkers of what could be the possibility, followed up with the engineering who would take it and make it a reality.
I grew up loving Star Trek. In fact, I do think it's one of the things that got me into wanting to become an astronaut. I was definitely a big trekker in space.
Is there anything out of science fiction that you'd like to see at NASA now?
Wow, if we could travel at light speed or teleport, that would be pretty cool. But honestly, being in space, it feels like science fiction come true.
Science fiction has sort of become science fact. You start to look at cell phones and what's happened. It's like we almost have a tricorder, right? It's not too long before you're going to be able to take out your cell phone and scan yourself and go, okay, well, my ribs aren't broken and my heart's working. I get my heart rate from my, my watch now. So, I think there's a lot of things that are definitely analogs and push what we're doing in terms of engineering and science from science fiction.
It's the mystery of exploration and wanting to go places, that famous line from Star Trek, right? To boldly go where no one has gone before. That just spoke to me, it was so appealing. The sense of adventure, the sense of journey of going places. The team, this undercurrent, which is in the whole Star Trek story of being part of an amazing team where everybody contributes and everybody's motivated and everybody wants to do the best that they possibly can. And of course, this utopian vision of a world where we all get along as human beings and we really take care of each other.
While we were in space, it happened that unfortunately Leonard Nimoy passed away. So we were able to do a tribute for him. And so science fiction has had an impact on me and my other crewmates from childhood even till today.
Well, we're now joined by Dr. Margaret Weidekamp, a curator here at the National Air and Space Museum. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, I'm delighted.
Now, Margaret, we're standing in the Boeing Milestones of Flight Hall, surrounded by some of the most iconic artifacts in space and aviation history. We've got Spaceship One, Bell X-1, the lunar module, and the Spirit of St. Louis. But behind us is a fictional prop. Why is that here?
Well, it's actually been here since before this building was built. The museum acquired the 11-foot studio model of the Star Trek Starship Enterprise used in all of the shows of the original series in 1974. The museum has always been interested in these imagined visions of spaceflight and in visualizations of flight generally. Star Trek is a wonderful example.
Now, we've been talking about fact and fiction,
Yes.
and Star Trek inspired a lot of inventions that are now becoming reality. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, well, very much as Rod Roddenberry said, the writers and developers of the show were looking at what was perhaps on the drawing board and might come out. And they also then just had a lot of fun dreaming up some ideas of what they would love to have, something that you could tap and communicate with. Being able to really work with computers and talk to them and get all the information you need. And more, we're seeing it come true.
Now, should we take a little bit more of a look at some of this technology that's come to be?
Oh, I think that would be a great idea.
Are you ready to go?
I'm ready to go. Engage. As Marty said, there's a lot of technology out there. Now this STEM It to Win It is a little different because you guys are going to have to choose. I'm going to give you something that was used on Star Trek. You're going to have to choose whether it was fact, fiction, or somewhere in between. Are you guys ready for our first piece of technology? Okay. Our first piece of technology, introduced in Star Trek 50 years ago, is the communicator. All right, they use this, it looked like this, and they use this to communicate over long distances. Do you think that today this is fact, fiction, or somewhere in between? Go stand in front of where you think it is. Okay, all of you chose fact. So why didn't you tell me, why did you choose fact?
I chose fact because they use communicators in the ship. We use communicators now.
We use communicators now. And to give us what is the right answer, Margaret, is it fact or fiction? They are all exactly right. In fact, it is fact. Many of you probably have a smartphone or a cell phone in your pocket or in your purse, in your bag. And we know that the inventor for Motorola who came up with the flip phone was thinking very directly about the Star Trek communicator and that wonderful flip motion. Now we tend to use things where we're actually combining multiple devices into one. Okay, so are you guys ready for the next piece of technology? This is called a tricorder. A tricorder was created for the Star Trek series, and what it did was they would move the tricorder up and down over somebody's body to get a medical diagnosis. Whether you had a broken bone or you had some sort of infection, they could tell using the tricorder. Now, is that fact, fiction, or somewhere in between? Okay, it looks like they're all, okay, we've got one piece of fiction. Let's ask the fiction guy, why do you think it's fiction?
I don't think that they use that now, so.
You don't think they use it today?
No.
Okay, well, why did you guys pick in between?
Because it's like an X-ray.
It's like an X-ray. Okay, Margaret, what do you think? Actually, it's in between and it is moving from fiction to fact. There is a Qualcomm Tricorder X Prize right now, and there's a whole series of teams that have been working on ways to create a device that without being invasive, without a shot, without cutting into you, you'd be able to figure out how your body is doing. The teams delivered their devices in San Diego a few months ago, and there are a number of teams that are working on trying to create a tricorder. So it's coming. It's coming. Okay. The next one, are you guys ready for the next one?
Yep.
Is called a tractor beam. In Star Trek, they use the tractor beam to capture one spaceship to pull it toward the next spaceship kind of like an invisible rope. Is this fact, fiction, or in between today? Where are you going? Are you doing in between? Why do you think, everyone thought it was fiction except you. Why do you think in between?
Today we use like magnets to connect stuff like string.
Sure.
But then back then they used to like use heavy stuff.
Yep.
So I figured between.
Okay, in between, kind of like magnets. Margaret, what is it?
Actually, you're right, in between. There's a group at New York University that is actually using a light wave to pull things towards you. Those things are microscopic right now, so it's not big enough to pull one spaceship towards another spaceship. But as the gentleman there, the researcher likes to say, they're hundreds of years ahead of schedule for developing a tractor beam.
Okay, are we ready for our last one? You guys ready for our last one? Teleportation. In the original Star Trek series, they used to beam matter from one place to the next to get to a place far away. Is that fact, fiction, or somewhere in between? Go ahead and line up where you guys think. Teleport. Okay. All right. It all looks like you guys all said fiction. Why did you say fiction? You don't know. Why did you say fiction?
I said fiction because like we don't really have teleporters in like real life. I mean, we have them in movies and video games, but not in real life.
Not in real life. Margaret, fact or fiction?
As much as we would love this to be so, it is still very much a part of fiction. And I think anyone in the DC area would love to be able to beam from one place to the next and avoid the traffic.
Yeah.
But right now we're still waiting for a transporter.
Okay, should we take some questions?
I'd love to take some
questions. Okay, let's take an online question first. What is the Enterprise model made of?
Actually, it's mostly wood that is painted. There's some vacuum-formed plastic on the top and bottom of the saucer sections and a little bit of rolled metal in the back of the engine pods or the nacelles. But actually, the model was made of wood in 1964 because it was the least expensive way to make it. And that works out beautifully for us because it's actually held up very nicely over 50 years.
Okay, and we do have an audience question. You have my first question. What is your question?
It was, what does NCC 1701 mean?
Okay.
Oh, that's a great question. So the call letters on the Enterprise model, what does NCC 1701 mean? And there's been a lot of debate about that, about whether this was the designer, Matt Jeffries' tail number on his private airplane. Generally, it was the idea of putting letters and numbers onto the USS Enterprise that would identify it. NC had been the letters and are the letters that are on tail numbers of private aircraft. And I'm told that he put the numbers in the font across the room from him and looked at them, and 1, 7, 0, and 1 were the numbers that were the easiest to identify at a glance. You know, a 8 can look like a 3, but those were easily identified, and the idea of creating a number that was somewhat big created the idea that this might be part of a long series of spaceships, although the 1 gives it a kind of uniqueness.
Okay.
So
let's take an online question. Are there other science fiction objects on display at the museum?
Very much so. The museum has a Buck Rogers toy that is in our Moving Beyond Earth exhibit. That's an illustration of the ways that people started thinking about a winged vehicle years before the space shuttle orbiters were created in the 1970s. We have toys up in the Pioneers Gallery that show the ways that people have imagined flight and space flight. And then having the Enterprise here, we also have a wonderful case of space science fiction toys at the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center out by Dulles Airport.
Now, Star Trek it was a television show, but
Yes.
it's sort of gained a life of its own over the years. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about how that happened?
It has. It started as a 3-season television show on NBC from 1966 to 1969, and the museum got this model in 1974 because I think the people at Paramount really didn't think there would be anything else to it. But they had created this rich world that had rules, had a bit of a Bible that governed it, and eventually it spawned 6 more television series, 13 more major motion pictures, a world of conventions and uniforms and languages and fans. And what's fun about that is it all works together in kind of one universe defined by this Bible, by this canon. And so the cultures that have been created have been really rich.
And part of that is language, and the Klingon language was actually invented for these movies.
Yes, it started out as somewhat gibberish that was created for some of the early movies, but by Star Trek III, they actually brought in a linguist, and he developed out not only the language, but the culture of the Klingons and the Vulcans, 2 of the alien species.
And I actually had a chance to talk to the inventor, Mark Okrand. Let's see what he had to say. Now I'm joined by Mark Okrand, and you invented the Klingon language, is that correct?
Correct.
And for what, it wasn't the original program?
No, in the original program they never spoke the Klingon language. And I came to it with Star Trek III. And I started with the few lines that Jimmy Doohan had created and expanded from there because there was a lot more dialogue in Star Trek III than there had been in anything in the past.
Before you started on Star Trek, you were a fellow here at the Smithsonian and you studied languages.
Right.
Why is it important that we study language at all?
It's important to study language at all because that's what makes us human, I think. I think it's a great, gives us great insight into the way we think, the way we deal with each other, where we come from, and hopefully where we're going. And it opens up the whole world. And by studying different languages, you learn different ways of looking at things. There's not only one way to do things. One of the greatest excitements for someone who deals with a couple of different languages is translating from one to the other, because it's not word, 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 word. You have to think about, okay, what is the original person trying to say using that language, and how am I going to change that into this other language, given the cultural differences between the two and so on. Just thinking about all that is fascinating and insightful and helpful.
Mark, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Really appreciate it.
Good, thanks.
Now, Margaret, the model that we're standing in front of was used for fiction, science fiction, but there's been some real science that's gone into the restoration of this. Can you tell us about it?
Yes, this model came into the museum's collection in 1974, and it's been worked on in 74, 84, 91. And then around 2010, we started to really notice that this model, which was then about 40 years old, was really starting to show some sagging and cracking and crazing in the paint. And so we did what we do for all of the objects here at the museum. We brought in our conservators who are really scientists to analyze it and then to help us fix it.
And the Enterprise wasn't designed to last 50 years, was it?
No, this was something that they thought would be taken apart and moved from place to place so that they could get the shots that they wanted at different special effects studios. But nobody thought it was going to be a museum piece 40 or 50 years later. And so we really were able to do some wonderful analysis and try to bring it back to a specific point in time.
Which is? Which
is the end of shooting in the 2nd season. They reused the film in the 3rd season to save money. And it's actually the Trouble with Tribbles episode, which is an iconic episode from Star Trek, and also the last time that any physical changes were made to the model when it was being shot.
Now, Star Trek also used the narrative of the show to talk about larger issues.
Very much so. The creators and the writers were really thinking very creatively about the ways that space science fiction allows you to put contemporary things from the same time in a different space context and allow you to have a little bit of distance and think about them in new ways. So they talked about race relations, they talked about gender relations, they talked about politics, they talked about social issues, but they did it by encountering aliens in a way that allowed you to see it with new eyes.
Wow. You ready to take some more questions?
I'd love to.
All right, let's start with an online question. Why is the Enterprise model a different color than what you see on the TV show?
This is a question that we get a lot, in part because when a studio model was shot in the 1960s, it would have been under very bright lights, and then they would have masked out the background to put in the star fields or the planets or things like that. And in fact, I think from the beginning of this show, that's film of this model, and I was noticing how much more gray it shows up on screen than it looks a little more green when you see it in person, and that's because they knew it would go through this post-production.
Awesome. All right, how about an audience question?
What interests you of what you do?
What made you interested in what you're doing, Margaret?
How did you get interested in what you do?
I have always been a space science fiction fan on my own, and I got interested in space history when I was doing my doctoral work and researching a women's astronaut testing program from the 1950s. And I just saw so many connections between space science fiction and real space.
Awesome. All right, let's go to an online question next. How long did it take for the original designers to build the Enterprise studio model?
It was designed by a man named Walter Matthews Jeffries, who worked for Star Trek, and then Richard C. Dayton Jr. actually built it. It took them a period of weeks to actually build this model, and then it was actually changed a few times from when it was initially rolled out. When they started production, they added all of the wonderful lights and effects inside it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for answering those questions. Those are great questions, guys, and those of you online. Our next show is coming up in just a few short weeks from the Albuquerque International Balloon Fiesta. Here's a little preview.
Check this out. In 1935, this balloon gondola traveled over 13 miles into the air to set a world record that lasted for 20 years. Gas balloons controlled their altitude by dropping weight called ballast. Each of these ballast bags weighed about 70 pounds. In order to control altitude, the pilot would blow a hole in the bottom of the bag to release fine metal shavings so it wouldn't hurt anybody on the ground. We still fly gas balloons today. Do you ever wonder how we control them? If you think that's cool, be sure to join us next month when we will be live from the Albuquerque International Balloon Fiesta.
Margaret, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome.
I'd also like to thank the Gertrude E. Skelly Charitable Foundation for sponsoring the show today. And I want to point out that on our website, we have some additional resources for teachers. We're using Smithsonian Learning Labs to add resources. Smithsonian Learning Labs is very similar to Pinterest, only with artifacts from all of the Smithsonian museums. We've added reading lists, we've added images, and we've added videos. Really? Now you put on the mask? The show is over. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. As we leave you, take a look at some of the incredible costumes that we saw a week ago to celebrate Star Trek's 50th anniversary here at the museum. Thanks for watching. Live long and prosper.